Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was in the waning days of October, during one of those peculiarly still afternoons in Baker Street, that the fog began to press against our window panes with such oppressive determination that it seemed less a mist of nature and more a manifestation of some lurking disquiet. London, in such moods, wears the countenance of a city under a spectral veil, its carriages muted, its footsteps muffled, and even the gas lamps burning with an uncertain pallor. Sherlock Holmes sat in his customary position before the hearth, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes closed, and brow furrowed in that particular expression which I had come to associate with some inner calculus of extraordinary complexity. For myself, I had been reading the Times, though without any genuine interest, and was just about to remark upon the unseasonably heavy gloom when Holmes stirred. "There is something curious in the air today, Watson," he murmured without opening his eyes. "Do you perceive it?" I glanced toward the fire, uncertain whether he spoke of the atmosphere or some more intangible quality. "The fog, you mean?" "Not just the fog," he replied, his eyes now open, sharp and glinting with thought. "There is something else, some intrusion upon the natural order, an echo of footsteps yet to arrive." Before I could inquire further, a sharp rap at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson, who seldom knocked unless occasion truly demanded it, stepped in with an apologetic nod. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent. Wouldn't leave until I fetched you myself." Holmes glanced at me with the faintest flicker of amusement before rising. "Ah, you see, Watson. The echo arrives." He motioned towards the door, his voice calm but expectant. "Let us meet our shadowed caller." The woman who entered was shrouded not only by the dark folds of her travelling cloak, but also by an unmistakable air of apprehension. Her bearing was dignified, aristocratic even, though her trembling hands betrayed the inner storm that raged beneath her composed exterior. She paused at the threshold, as though uncertain whether she had stepped into a sanctuary or a confessional. "I thank you for seeing me without appointment," she said, her voice low and tremulous. "I am Lady Eugenia Blackwater." Holmes extended a hand, offering her the seat nearest the fire. "You are most welcome, Lady Blackwater. Please be at ease. Dr. Watson and I are at your service." She sat, clasping her gloved hands tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed upon the flickering coals. "My journey has been sudden and compelled by something so absurd, so unexplainable, that I fear you will find me either mad or foolish." "We are well accustomed to matters which fall outside the jurisdiction of the ordinary," Holmes replied gently. "Do proceed." Lady Blackwater drew a slow breath. "It concerns our family estate, Gallowsmere Hall in Kent. I returned there only last fortnight, after many years abroad. My brother Sir Lionel is the current master of the house. Since my arrival, however, I have become witness to events that defy all rational accounting." Her eyes flicked toward me, then back to Holmes. "We possess a portrait, an ancestral piece, Lord Reginald Blackwater, painted in 1721, a cold, imposing thing, but always lifeless, until now." "Until now?" I repeated. She nodded, her voice dropping to a whisper. "3 days ago, one of the maids found it, Bleeding. Blood, Mr. Holmes, trickling from the eyes, fresh and red upon the canvas. Neither Holmes nor I spoke. Lady Blackwater continued. There was no tear, no rupture. The paint was intact. The blood, real. The servants are terrified. One has disappeared. And my brother, he speaks to the portrait, holds whispered conversations with it at night. Her voice quavered. I have come to you because I fear this is no longer a family matter. It is something darker, something unnatural. Holmes, who had thus far remained in his armchair with his fingertips pressed together, now leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with sudden interest. This portrait, tell me more, he said quietly. Lady Blackwater swallowed. It hangs in the North Gallery. It has always been there. My father claimed it should never be moved. The likeness is of Lord Reginald Blackwater, a grim man in life, and by reputation given to unholy studies. Alchemy, necromancy, spiritualism, whatever dark art was in fashion among the curious minds of his age, he pursued it. And it bled from the eyes. Yes, only the eyes. The maid who discovered it fainted outright. When I was summoned, the blood had already begun to dry. We examined the painting thoroughly. There was no injury to the canvas, no external source. And yet, unmistakably, it was blood. Human blood, I asked. I could not say. It smelled of iron. Sir Lionel ordered the gallery closed. But since then, there have been other signs. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Such as? The staff speaks of whispers, doors creaking open by themselves. At night, there are soft chants, low voices without a source. One of the servants, a young woman named Beatrice, has vanished entirely. And my brother. She hesitated. He has grown strange, withdrawn. His conversations with the portrait are not the mutterings of a madman, but something worse. Deliberate, measured dialogues, as though the painting replies. I have found him asleep before it, as though in some exhausted trance. He insists it speaks to him, that it is warning him. Holmes stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fog that pressed against the glass. A bleeding portrait, a vanished maid, a brother descending into delusion or possession, and all this in a house already steeped in superstition. You have done wisely to come to us, Lady Blackwater. He turned suddenly. Tell me, has your brother made any changes to his habits, his diet, his social circle, anyone new within the household? She paused. No new staff, though there is one visitor, a scholar, Professor Adrian Colville. He arrived 2 weeks ago. An old friend of Lionel's from university. He is researching our family's history. Holmes nodded, more to himself than to us. I believe, Watson, we must see Gallowsmere Hall for ourselves. Lady Blackwater paused for a moment, as if weighing the prudence of speaking further. Then, with a visible tremor in her voice, she continued. There is more, Mr. Holmes. The portrait was only the beginning. Since that morning, something has taken hold of Gallowsmere Hall, an atmosphere not merely of dread, but of decay. The servants walk the halls in fearful silence, some having packed their belongings and left without notice. They speak of voices in the dark, of shadows that move against the grain of light. One footman swore he heard his name whispered from an empty room 3 times. He departed the following day. Holmes inclined his head slightly, fingers steepled once more. And your brother? Her eyes clouded with helplessness. He grows more distant by the hour, at times lucid, even courteous, but always preoccupied. He no longer dines with the family. He remains in the gallery until the early hours, speaking in low tones to the portrait. I have stood outside the door and listened. He converses with it, as one might speak to a confidant. I heard him say, "Yes, I understand. Yes, it must be done." Holmes did not interrupt. "I have tried to remove the painting. He forbade it. Declared it would kill him to do so. He believes utterly that it is watching him, guiding him. I fear that he is being pulled into something far beyond reason." I leaned forward, unable to suppress a shudder. "And the scholar you mentioned? This Professor Colville. Does he share your concerns?" "I wish he did," she replied. "But he encourages Lionel's interest. Says the portrait is a key to unlocking ancestral memory. He speaks in riddles and cloaked references. And though he is always polite, I sense something beneath his charm, something cold." Holmes stood abruptly. "We must leave for Kent tomorrow, Watson," he said briskly. "There is something more than superstition at work here. Something constructed." "And you believe it can be solved?" Holmes gave the faintest of smiles. "When blood flows from canvas and reason slips through candle smoke, one must look not at the shadows, Watson, but at the hand that casts them." It was a grey and sullen morning when Holmes and I departed from Charing Cross, bound for the Kentish countryside. The train moved with a rhythmic monotony, but my companion remained characteristically alert, his long, slender fingers interlaced and eyes narrowed as though each click of the rails formed another line in the puzzle before him. "I confess, Holmes," I ventured, "this case strikes me as more fanciful than most. Bleeding portraits, whispering voices, are we not being drawn into mere theatrics?" He did not glance my way but murmured, "Theatrical, yes. But theatre requires a playwright, and behind every illusion lies intent. We are not hunting phantoms, Watson. We are tracing the shape of a very real hand." I fell into thoughtful silence, watching the scenery change. As the city fell away, so too did the pretense of light. The landscape that stretched beyond the window pane seemed to droop under the weight of its own gloom. Sparse trees bent with an almost supplicant posture, their limbs bare of leaves. The fields, choked with morning mist, appeared more spectral than solid. By noon, we reached the station at Blackmere Heath, where a coachman bearing the Blackwater crest awaited our arrival. He was a wiry man of few words, and though his manner was civil, there was an air of anxiety about him that did not go unnoticed. "The staff has been unsettled, sir," he confessed as we rode. "They say the hall is cursed. Some won't stay past sunset." Holmes only nodded, his gaze fixed on the winding road ahead. "And yourself?" "I stay because I've seen worse, sir. But I'll not go near the North Gallery after dark." The countryside grew more oppressive as we neared our destination, the trees clustering tightly about the road, the mist deepening with each mile. And then, quite suddenly, Gallowsmere Hall came into view, a great brooding structure of age-darkened stone that seemed less constructed than exhumed. It stood upon a rise like some watchful sentinel of the past, its upper windows staring blankly over the land like the eyes of a sleeping giant. I confess, a chill passed through me at the sight of it. As we crossed the threshold of Gallowsmere Hall, it struck me at once that the building possessed a silence far deeper than mere stillness. It was as if the house had chosen to listen. We were received by a manservant whose expression was carefully neutral, but whose eyes darted ever so slightly to the long corridor behind him. The hall itself was grand in scale but dim in temperament, its tapestries dulled with dust, and portraits hung like watching ghosts above a cold stone floor. Lady Eugenia, who had preceded us by some hours, met us in the drawing-room. She offered no pleasantries, only a hushed urgency. "Sir Lionel is upstairs," she said. He has refused all food since last night. He paces the portrait gallery alone, murmuring to it as if in prayer. Holmes inclined his head gravely. We shall not disturb him just yet. Tell me, has anything changed since your visit to Baker Street? She hesitated. The servants are more afraid than before. One footman left this morning without a word, and last night I heard something. Chanting, low and rhythmic. It seemed to come from behind the walls. We spoke no further then, for even Holmes appeared momentarily absorbed by the strange ambience of the place. The house, though not in disrepair, had the unmistakable pallor of neglect, of memories too heavy to keep polished. A maid named Elspeth, thin and pale, guided us to our quarters. As we passed through the upper halls, I noted the way she crossed herself when we approached the north wing. Holmes said nothing but gave me a sharp glance. When she departed, he remarked quietly, "Observe, Watson. Fear does not simply reside here, it circulates. The servants do not merely sense something amiss, they are actively haunted." "And do you share their superstition?" "No," he replied, "but I respect the mechanisms by which fear is engineered." It was in the dim-lit hours of early evening that we were finally admitted into the North Gallery. Lady Eugenia accompanied us only to the threshold and would go no farther. Holmes opened the tall, groaning door with the care of a surgeon preparing for a delicate incision. Sir Lionel Blackwater stood before the portrait of his infamous ancestor, silent and motionless. He did not turn at our entrance, nor did he acknowledge us until Holmes softly addressed him, "Sir Lionel." Only then did the man shift. He turned slowly, revealing a face haggard beyond its years. His skin was pale, drawn tight across his cheekbones, and his eyes carried the unfocused intensity of the deeply troubled. "My sister has summoned you," he said dully. "You've come to judge me." "Not at all," Holmes answered evenly. "We've come to understand." Sir Lionel gestured vaguely toward the painting. "Do you hear it?" he asked, voice low and hoarse. "It speaks to me, softly but clearly. It warns of what is coming." Holmes stepped closer to the canvas. Lord Reginald Blackwater stared forth from the frame, his painted gaze cold and commanding, with eyes that seemed to follow the viewer no matter the angle. A thick border of blackened oak framed the work, its edges oddly free of dust. "Do you speak with it often?" Holmes inquired. "Each night. It comes when the hall is quiet. It tells me secrets, of the bloodline, of the cost, and what does it demand?" Sir Lionel closed his eyes. "That I listen." Holmes did not respond at once. Instead, he knelt before the frame and examined the space beneath it with great care. "You are not mad, Sir Lionel," he said at last, "but you are being deceived." "By whom?" "That," Holmes said as he rose, "is what we intend to discover." Holmes crouched before the painting once more, drawing a match from his coat pocket and striking it with practiced ease. The small flare of light revealed something I had overlooked entirely. The lower ridge of the frame bore not a speck of dust, though the rest of the gallery lay in a state of dignified neglect. He passed the flame slowly along the edge, nodding to himself. "Curious," he murmured. "What do you see?" I asked, stepping forward. "Nothing, and therein lies the answer," he replied cryptically. "An old frame in an old house, yet there is no dust. Not merely cleaned, Watson, but protected, maintained." He stood, sniffing the air with that peculiar intensity of his, the flame now held before the painting's surface. "There," he said. "Do you detect it?" I moved closer. There was a faint metallic tang, something I could not immediately place. "Blood?" I ventured. He shook his head. A compound, a solution containing iron, no doubt, but altered, thickened, artificial. You believe it was applied deliberately. I believe, he replied, that what dripped from this painting did not come from any wound, but from a reservoir carefully concealed. He stepped back and gestured toward the trio of blackened candles on the narrow table beside the portrait. Do you notice their arrangement? I looked. One before the frame, two flanking it. The wax had burned unevenly, pooling in long rivulets. A ritual, or the appearance of one, Holmes said. The central candle lies directly beneath the eyes of the subject. I dare say the heat would rise, just enough to soften a substance concealed above or behind. When it melts, it drips. And the whispering? He said nothing but tapped the wall behind the frame. The sound was hollow, thinner than stone. Plaster over passage, he muttered, or perhaps over piping. A voice could travel through it. I watched as Holmes took one final glance at the painting. Someone has engineered a haunting, he said, and they have done so with remarkable precision. The following morning, Holmes began what he termed a silent inquisition, and I had come to learn this meant he would be moving swiftly and saying very little until his mind had absorbed all it required. We descended to the lower quarters, where Lady Eugenia had arranged for the staff to be made discreetly available. Our first subject was Mr. Denby, the butler, a narrow-shouldered man of advanced years, with a voice that rasped like leaves dragged across stone. "I won't lie to you, gentlemen," he began, after Holmes assured him of discretion. "This house has changed since his lordship's moods turned strange. There's something unnatural about the air in that gallery. And what's more, I've seen a figure twice now, roaming it past midnight." "A figure?" Holmes asked. "Male or female? Tall, robed, couldn't say more than that, didn't stay to inquire." Holmes jotted something in his notebook and dismissed the man kindly. Our next interview was with a young maid, Miss Annabel, whose nervous glances made clear she would rather be anywhere else. "I was cleaning in the east corridor, sir," she said, "near the servants' stairs. I'd just come up with the morning linens when I saw someone, a hooded person, slip through the far arch near the portrait room. They moved fast, silent as anything." "Did you follow?" She shook her head, trembling. "No, sir. I turned and ran." Holmes questioned two others with little new to report, save for vague references to hearing faint music at night. But it was the mention of the sealed attic by a third footman, a fellow called Rees, that drew Holmes to sudden stillness. "The attic above the north wing," Rees said. "Far as I know, no one's been up there in 20 years, locked from the outside. The key's in the steward's office, but no one uses it." Holmes turned to me the moment Rees left. "We must inspect that attic, Watson, not later, now." And so we did. The lock, thick with rust, surrendered to Holmes's deft manipulation. The stairs groaned in protest as we ascended. Inside, dust cloaked everything. But on the floor, just beneath the attic's single narrow vent, lay scattered fragments of wax and a spent match. Holmes stared at it for some time before whispering, "So the voice had a throat, and it spoke from here." He turned to me with eyes sharpened by revelation. "We are not merely observing a deception, Watson. We are walking through its theatre." The incident occurred scarcely a day after our inspection of the sealed attic. I had just returned from a solitary walk along the frost-stiffened hedges flanking the estate when I was met by a breathless footman, pale as chalk and near incoherent. She's by the lake, sir," he managed. "Miss Beatrice. They found her, unmoving." Summoning Holmes at once, We followed the lad down the winding path behind the east wing, past a line of blackthorn bushes until we came upon a cluster of staff gathered round a motionless figure on the damp bank. It was indeed the missing maid, her dress torn and muddied, her face unnaturally still. One of the older women wept quietly beside her, clutching the girl's limp hand. "She lives," Holmes announced after a brief examination, though her pulse is faint and her mind quite elsewhere. I crouched beside him, noting the curious expression that had crossed his face, one of interest tinged with disquiet. "There's something else," he said. "Hold the lantern higher." It was then I saw it, a mark about the size of a sovereign, burned into the skin of her collarbone. It was not a wound of accident or flame, but of deliberation, a perfect circle within which lay a symbol, an inverted trident, etched with astonishing precision. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then, very softly, he murmured, "I have seen this before. Once. Years ago. In Budapest, I started." "You believe it has meaning?" He nodded. "More than meaning, it has intent. This is not the mark of superstition, Watson. This is design." We had her moved to the drawing room and laid upon a couch. Lady Eugenia arrived shortly thereafter, her face blanched with fear. Holmes, ever gentle with the agitated, took her aside and asked a simple question. "Has your family any historical association with secret societies or esoteric orders?" She blinked. There were whispers about Reginald, about rites he performed during his travels, but nothing was ever proven. Holmes looked back at the maid. "Then the past," he said, "is no longer content with its silence." That evening, as we sat once more before the cold hearth in the study adjoining our rooms, Holmes remained uncharacteristically subdued. His violin rested untouched against the wall, and the familiar gleam of energetic deduction had been replaced with something far more rare in him, contemplative silence. "You're disturbed," I remarked at last, setting down my pen, "not by fear, but by complexity." He nodded slowly. "You are correct, Watson. This case frustrates not because it eludes my logic, but because it defies the framework of logic itself. It is built upon suggestion, upon psychology. Someone here is crafting not merely a deception, but a delusion, and doing so with exceptional skill." I leaned forward. "Do you mean to say that Sir Lionel's descent was orchestrated?" "Not in the sense of hypnotic trance or poison," Holmes replied, "but through symbols, whispers, shadows, elements that bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the unconscious. You recall the attic, the wax, the vent? Of course." He steepled his fingers, gazing into the unlit grate. "The voice he hears is real in sound, but false in source. The blood is real in appearance, but artificial in origin. What is being perpetrated here is not simply trickery, it is theatre, and our victim is not the audience, but the actor being coaxed to believe his own lines." I said nothing, for the very notion unsettled me. The idea that one could engineer madness so precisely as to steer a man into communion with a portrait chilled me more than any tale of phantoms or curses. "There is genius in it," Holmes muttered. "Malevolent, yes, but genius all the same. This is not some amateur séance or midnight hoax. This has been studied, tested. The mind of the Blackwater heir is being dismantled by someone who knows how." He rose then and walked to the window, where mist still clung like damp gauze to the glass. "I must find the mechanism," he said. "There is always a mechanism, and when it is revealed, the illusion collapses." The following morning, Holmes insisted we return to the North Gallery before the rest of the household had risen. Armed with nothing more than a small brush, a candle, and that ineffable air of certainty which so often preceded his most brilliant deductions, He set to work. He began at the frame, brushing lightly along the base and corners, his attention fixed on the subtle patterns left by time and neglect. I stood aside, watching his every movement, and it was only after some minutes that he paused and uttered a quiet, satisfied, "Ah." "What is it?" I asked. He knelt and used the edge of a business card to lift something barely visible from the wooden floor, a series of tiny, reddish flecks. "Iron filings," he said, "coarse but consistent." "From the frame?" "Unlikely," he replied. "Frames are rarely made of anything that would shed like this. More probably, something beneath." He examined the area around the base of the portrait, then reached into his coat and produced a slim blade which he inserted between the floorboards. With a practiced twist, a small panel popped upward, revealing a shallow compartment. Within it was a slender metal tube, capped at both ends, and lined with a trace of dried residue along the edge. Holmes uncapped it and sniffed briefly. "A compound of pig's blood and glycerin," he said, "thickened to delay coagulation, warmed to simulate freshness. Ingenious." I stared. "So the bleeding was mechanical?" He nodded. Heat from the candles below activated a pressure valve within the frame. The reservoir, when warm enough, released its contents through capillary holes drilled behind the painted eyes. Subtle, precise. But why the iron filings? To mask the scent. Iron carries the illusion of blood. Those who smell it believe more readily what their eyes fear to confirm. He replaced the board and stood. The deception is thorough, but now we know the substance, the apparatus, and the intent. What remains, he said, is the architect, and with that, he turned briskly toward the door. "There is one name that keeps appearing at the periphery of every shadow here, Watson. I think it's time we paid a visit to Professor Adrian Colville." It was just past midday when Holmes and I made our way to the eastern edge of the Blackwater estate, where the old orchard, long overgrown, gave shelter to a modest stone cottage. This dwelling, I was informed, had been let for the season to Professor Adrian Colville, whose presence at Gallowsmere had, until now, been a shadow on the edge of every conversation. Colville received us in a room lined with books, arcane tomes in Latin, Greek, and older tongues I could scarcely name. He was a man of indeterminate age, with sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, and a manner both courteous and unsettling. His voice was refined, but his words held the careful ambiguity of one accustomed to concealing more than he revealed. "My dear Mr. Holmes," he said, "you must pardon the surroundings. I live simply when I research. Complexity, you see, belongs to the mind, not the furnishings." Holmes offered a nod. "And what is it you are presently researching, Professor?" "The Blackwater lineage," Colville replied. "A fascinating line, intertwined with European esoteric movements, medieval heresies, and even Eastern mysticism. Lord Reginald, in particular, was a man far ahead of his time, though widely misunderstood, as most pioneers are." Holmes glanced toward a shelf upon which rested several candle stubs, their wicks charred and crumbling. "You were close to Sir Lionel. We were companions at Oxford. His mind, even then, leaned toward abstraction. He was drawn to questions few dare ask, about the veil between consciousness and what lies beyond. I encouraged his inquiries. Yes, but I never misled him." "Do you believe," Holmes asked, "that his recent behaviour is rational?" Colville smiled faintly. "Rationality is a matter of perspective. If you stare long enough into your ancestry, something is bound to stare back." At that, Holmes straightened. "And if a portrait stares back, and bleeds. Colville's smile did not falter. Then perhaps it is only giving what was taken from it. When we departed, Holmes remained silent until we were well down the lane. At last he said, "He is either mad or a very dangerous man pretending not to be." "Do you think he orchestrated the portrait's illusion?" Holmes glanced back at the cottage. "I think he would be capable of more than illusion, Watson. I think we are dealing with someone who understands not only how to frighten a man, but how to shape his madness." That evening brought a kind of hush over Gallowsmere, as if the house itself anticipated revelation. Holmes remained withdrawn through supper, speaking little, eyes distant. Afterward, he summoned Lady Eugenia to the drawing-room and asked, in his quiet and unwavering manner, whether her brother had made any recent alterations to his will. She hesitated. "There has been talk. He mentioned it briefly some days ago. Something about ensuring the preservation of the portrait, the family line. I thought it the ramblings of his state." "Would you inquire with the solicitor?" Holmes asked. Discreetly. She returned within the hour, pale. "It's true. The new draft leaves the estate and all its holdings to Professor Colville on the condition that the portrait remain untouched." Even I, who had begun to suspect as much, found the confirmation jarring. Holmes nodded, but his expression had darkened. Control, inheritance, legacy. He is tightening a noose of influence around a fragile mind, and now he binds it with ink. That night, we kept to our quarters, but Holmes didn't sleep. At a little past 2, we heard it, the low, rhythmic murmuring that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. It was not chant in the religious sense, but a sound, measured, pulsing, like a ritual reduced to pure cadence. Holmes motioned for silence. He crossed the room to the vent and placed his ear to the grating. "It's a voice," he whispered. "He's doing it again." "You mean Colville?" Holmes nodded. "From the attic, or perhaps a hidden passage. But the effect is the same. Sir Lionel will awaken, hear it, and believe it a calling." "And the candles?" "I passed through the gallery earlier," Holmes said. "There were 3 fresh ones at the base of the portrait, black wax this time. They were lit before nightfall. Another performance, another night of deepening madness." He turned to me, his voice low but electric. "I have seen enough. The final act must be ours." I felt the weight of those words as he stepped to the window and gazed into the fog beyond. "Tomorrow," he said, "we give the theatre back its ghost." It was with a tone of deliberate finality that Holmes, after luncheon the next day, announced to Lady Eugenia and Sir Lionel that he and I would be departing the estate come evening. He claimed that he had all he required, and that the matter now demanded only laboratory analysis and legal counsel in London. The words were spoken with the calm assurance of truth, but I knew them to be false. That night, as the clock struck 8, we made a studied exit from the front steps, bags in hand, and were seen off by the butler with a mix of relief and confusion. Yet no sooner had we rounded the lower bend of the estate road than Holmes pulled us into the bracken and whispered for absolute silence. "We are not leaving," he said simply. "We are arriving." He had planned it all. A circuitous route back to the rear of the house, a rope left hanging from the gardener's terrace, and dark garments already concealed behind the old stable wall. As he dressed in a cloak and hood to obscure his form, I could not help but remark, half in jest, that he resembled the very spectre we sought to unmask. "I trust," I said, "you've not mistaken the part." He smiled beneath the cowl. "Let us hope the villain has." Once fully garbed, Holmes took from his pocket a folded page, an architectural sketch of the North Gallery that Lady Eugenia had discreetly acquired from the Manor's records. It revealed a narrow access shaft behind the wall panels, long disused, but still viable for a man of his frame. "You will return to the guest wing," he told me, "and remain vigilant. If anything should go amiss, anything at all, sound the fire bell, but not before. And Lady Eugenia? She is already prepared. She will remain in her room and feign ignorance." With that, he vanished into the night, and I obeyed, retracing my steps through the servants' entrance. I passed no one, yet felt eyes in every hallway. The house had quieted, but not rested. It waited, as we all did, for midnight. The appointed hour drew near with excruciating slowness. I kept watch from the hallway adjoining the North Gallery, the heavy grandfather clock chiming each quarter hour like a judge counting down to some invisible sentence. At last, when the chimes fell silent at the stroke of 12, I made my way to the designated place, an alcove near the portrait room, from which Holmes had instructed I listen, but not intervene. He was already within, hidden behind the velvet curtains that framed the far end of the gallery, where ancestral portraits loomed like jurors. I knew not how he had entered, only that he was there, silent and unseen, waiting. The air was close and tense, filled with the kind of anticipation that knots the stomach and sharpens the senses. Then, without fanfare, a door creaked somewhere to the left, and footsteps, slow, deliberate, began to cross the floorboards. A figure entered the room. Even from my concealed vantage, I recognized the stature and bearing of Professor Adrian Colville. He wore a dark ceremonial robe, embroidered with strange curling symbols that shimmered faintly in the low light. In one hand he held a taper, in the other a small vial. He moved with precision, approaching the portrait and setting the taper before it, lighting the trio of black candles that had been positioned at its base. As the flames flickered to life, he removed a panel behind the frame with surprising deftness, revealing a narrow compartment. From this, he withdrew a metal cylinder, affixed it to a hidden device within the wall, and turned a small valve. The portrait's surface seemed to quiver. Then it began, again, that dreadful illusion, a thick, dark droplet emerging from beneath the painted eye of Lord Reginald, crawling downward like a tear of blood. Colville stepped back and began to speak, not to the room, but to the portrait. "The line is preserved," he intoned. "The heir accepts. The legacy continues." His voice was low, reverent, but in that moment, I heard a faint shift behind the curtain, and I knew Holmes was preparing to strike. The moment was unlike any I had witnessed before in our long career of investigations. A tableau at once theatrical and dreadful, its careful construction intended to deceive both the senses and the soul. Colville stood before the portrait of Lord Reginald Blackwater, his arms raised slightly, eyes half closed, as though invoking something both ancient and sovereign. With precise gestures, he lit the 3 candles, each flame guttering as if reluctant to take hold. The wax began to melt swiftly under the controlled heat, pooling toward the brass holders arranged on the carved pedestal beneath the painting. All the while, Colville murmured in a low chant, a fusion of Latin, Greek, and something I could not place. His voice reverent and detached, the cadence measured as though rehearsed. Then, from behind the canvas, a mechanism clicked softly. I saw it, the faintest shimmer behind the eye of the painted Lord Reginald, followed by a slow, almost reluctant trickle of dark red fluid. It wept from the painted iris like a tear of mourning. It was blood in appearance and effect, though Holmes had long since confirmed its true origin. Still, in the flickering candlelight, with the scent of burnt wax and iron in the air, the illusion was extraordinary. Even I, knowing all I knew, felt a momentary chill run the length of my spine. Colville stepped back, hands clasped before him like a man in prayer. He began to speak. Reginald of the line, guardian of blood and name, bear witness to the vow. He produced a sheet of parchment, aged, no doubt artificially, and held it before the portrait. The heir shall preserve the bond, the blood shall not be diluted, the house shall not fall. His voice was utterly composed, his eyes never leaving the painted face. Then, turning slowly, he retrieved the small vial and poured the remainder of its contents into the brass bowl at the portrait's base. The flames responded instantly, flaring for a breath, casting strange shadows on the walls before settling once more. It was then I realized the true power of his deception. This was not a trick performed in secret. This was a ritual, a production designed for a singular audience. Sir Lionel Blackwater. Holmes had said it best. This was theatre, and Lionel, night after night, had been its captive. Suddenly, the curtains behind Colville stirred. Holmes stepped forward, quietly, deliberately, casting his own shadow across the stage. Colville did not flinch. He did not even turn, as Holmes emerged from behind the curtains and came to stand between the ritualist and his stage. There was a brief silence, broken only by the hissing of the last candle wick as it struggled in its own wax. "You have chosen your audience poorly, Professor," Holmes said at last. "This performance may have deceived one man, but I assure you, it has failed to convince two." Colville turned, slowly and without surprise. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "how very diligent you are." "And how very rehearsed you've been," Holmes replied. "The mechanism was masterful. The blood, the vented voices, the candles, each detail calibrated to inspire belief and dread. And yet, a deception it remains." Holmes walked to the frame and pressed a section at the lower edge. With a faint click, the hidden panel opened, revealing the reservoir and valve within. "Pig's blood thickened with glycerin," he said, "released by the heat from the central candle. A simple siphon, ingenious in effect, crude in principle." Colville watched him calmly. "You mistake what I've done for a crime." Holmes's voice was ice. "You have driven a man to the edge of madness. You have manipulated him through fear, isolated him, then exploited his fragile state to insert yourself into his will and claim dominion over his ancestral home." "It was never about the estate," Colville said quietly. "It was about legacy. Lionel has no vision. He saw only bricks and trees. I saw the myth, revived. I gave it breath again." "You gave it artifice," Holmes replied. "You replaced science with spectacle and reason with whispering walls. You preyed on a man's bloodline, his pride, and his isolation. That, sir, is not scholarship. It is fraud." Colville's shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but resignation. "And what now, Mr. Holmes? Shall you drag me before a magistrate? On what charge? Trickery? Inspiration?" Holmes turned toward me. "No, Watson. Not a magistrate. A solicitor." He produced a sealed letter. "Lady Eugenia has already sent notice. The will is now contested, and Gallowsmere, like its heir, shall be restored." It was an hour before dawn when Sir Lionel was brought into the gallery. He had resisted at first, refusing to leave his chambers. But when Holmes placed in his hand the opened mechanism, the small reservoir of false blood, something in his gaze faltered. He approached the portrait without a word and looked into its painted eyes. Then he turned to us. "All this time," he whispered. I heard him. I heard him. Holmes stepped closer. You were made to, through vents, through ritual, through isolation and suggestion. It was never your ancestor's voice, Sir Lionel. It was his echo, crafted by the living. Sir Lionel dropped to his knees before the painting. I betrayed myself, he said. I thought I was chosen. I thought I was part of something greater. You are, Holmes said gently. You are a man, and that, I assure you, is far greater than any ghost. He did not reply, only wept softly before the portrait. As we left the room, Holmes turned back once, his eyes not on the painting, but on the man beneath it. The mind, he murmured, is a kingdom in which both gods and monsters dwell. The following morning, the gallery stood in a silence altogether different from that which had haunted it before. It was no longer the silence of dread, but that of aftermath, a strange stillness that lingers when theatre ends and the house lights rise. Lady Eugenia joined us there, her features drawn but resolute. Holmes stood before the portrait, his fingers steepled in thought. He motioned for us to approach. There is, I think, some satisfaction, he began, in demystifying the theatrical. Once the illusion is named, the ghost must return to the wings. He knelt beside the frame and pressed once more on the panel he had discovered the night before. With a soft, mechanical sigh, it opened, revealing the brass reservoir, its narrow tubing, and the wax-lined channel that fed through to the canvas. This, he said, is the engine of your phantom. The blood, so called, was pig's, mixed with glycerin to delay clotting. The candles beneath heated the chamber slowly, causing the fluid to expand and flow through these near-invisible apertures drilled directly behind the eyes of the painted figure. The more devout the viewer, the more supernatural the effect. Lady Eugenia bent to see, a hand to her mouth. But how did you find it? I asked. Holmes tapped the frame lightly. No dust, a curious anomaly in a room long untouched. When a house is governed by decay, one must ask why a single object remains pristine. That was the first clue. He then pointed to a series of minuscule scratch marks on the wood. And this, Watson, was the second. Maintenance. The hinges had been used often, recently, not by chance, but as part of a ritual. The illusion required regular tending. And the blood. Purchased, I believe, through a local abattoir. I've already sent word to Lestrade, who will trace the order. It was clever, not overtly criminal, yet perfectly engineered to disturb. He stepped back and folded his hands. The brilliance of the device lies not in its mechanics, but in its restraint. It offered just enough wonder to disorient, never enough clarity to question, and in doing so, it slipped past the mind's guard and into its dreams. Lady Eugenia whispered, and it very nearly took him. Holmes's expression darkened. It took more than we yet know. Having laid bare the mechanical deception, Holmes turned next to the smaller details, the flourishes that had given the illusion its unshakable air of authenticity. From his coat he retrieved the small sample jar in which he had earlier collected the reddish flecks found beneath the frame. Iron filings, he said, scattered in small quantities near the base of the portrait, swept just subtly enough not to arouse suspicion. And the purpose? I asked. To reinforce the illusion olfactorily, Holmes replied. Iron, as you know, gives off a metallic scent strongly associated in the human mind with blood. When the eye sees a crimson fluid, the mind questions. When the nose confirms it, the doubt weakens. That scent was not incidental. It was implanted, a stroke of psychological artistry. He gestured toward the frame, where the faint scent still lingered. The mind, Watson, is not persuaded by logic alone. It craves pattern, sensation, affirmation. This entire ruse was built to engage all three. Lady Eugenia looked on with growing disbelief. And the chanting? We come to that, Holmes replied. But before we do, observe this. He produced a blackened candle stub from his satchel. Ordinary wax, but soaked in a blend of herbs, mugwort, vervain, and a trace of belladonna. When burned, it releases a subtle aroma long associated with ritual and mysticism. It is meaningless in itself, but meaningful to the suggestible. The scent, the blood, the whispers, all parts of a carefully arranged pattern. And it worked, I said softly. Holmes gave a short nod. Colville understood not only how to deceive the senses, but how to prepare the mind to accept the deception. Sir Lionel was not a fool. He was a man slowly worn down by symbols, atmosphere, and isolation. No magic was ever used, only the power of suggestion, repeated often enough to become truth. Lady Eugenia closed her eyes. "You've given him back to me," she said. Holmes's reply was quiet. "No, Lady Blackwater, I've only given him a door. It remains for him to step through it." Our final stop was the attic once more, this time in daylight and in company. Holmes led us up the narrow stairwell, every creak of the steps now heavy with significance. At the far end, beneath the sloped roof, he indicated the small vent cut into the wooden panelling. "From this point," he said, Professor Colville projected his voice into the gallery below. The passage connects to a hollow cavity that runs behind the walls of the north wing, a remnant of old servant corridors, long since sealed to common use. He removed a slender copper funnel, affixed to a narrow tube that had been braced against the vent's inner edge. With the proper modulation and timing, he could speak directly to the air behind the portrait, transforming idle murmur into spectral whisper. He turned to Lady Eugenia. "Your brother was not hallucinating. He did hear voices. That was the key to the fraud. It confirmed his fear and made the irrational seem inevitable." "And the chanting?" I pressed. Holmes nodded. "Conducted from here as well. Not nightly, just often enough to be noticed. Its source was never seen, only felt. That is the language of superstition, Watson. Not direct confrontation, but suggestion through absence." He examined the floor, where once again the spent matches and candle wax told their quiet story. Every element of this scheme was executed with precision. A whisper at the right hour, a flickering light, a ritual staged for an unseen audience. Colville was not summoning spirits, he was summoning belief. Lady Eugenia's voice was low. "And he succeeded." Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "Yes, because he knew what all good illusionists know, that the strongest shadows are not cast by the object, but by the fear of it." We descended the attic stairs in silence. That silence followed us, I think, not because the house had been exorcised of ghosts, but because it had not. It had simply been returned to the custody of men. Holmes stood at the writing desk in Sir Lionel's study, reviewing the copy of the revised will which Lady Eugenia had, with some difficulty, procured from the family solicitor. He examined the document in silence, his gaze cool, yet resolute. "This," he said at last, "is not a legal paper. It is a confession of control." The clause in question was clear. In the event of Sir Lionel's demise, the entirety of the Blackwater estate, house, land, holdings, was to pass to Professor Adrian Colville. More chilling still, the language within spoke of preserving the ancestral influence, and ensuring the guardianship of the bloodline. The phrasing was not that of a solicitor, but of a cultist cloaked in legal garb. Colville's manipulation was not merely emotional, Holmes continued. It was financial, institutional. He sought not only to control the present mind, but to bind the future legacy. Lady Eugenia looked pale as parchment. You believe he intended to drive Lionel to surrender, yes, Holmes replied gravely. Perhaps not to death, but to abdication. Madness, declared by a physician, would render him unfit. In such a state, this will, however fantastical, might have stood unchallenged. And the hauntings? I asked. Staged with precision, Holmes said. The blood, the whispers, the rituals, all calculated to corrode rational thought. It was not Lionel's superstition Colville exploited, but his pride. The idea that he, as heir, was chosen to bear a secret too grand for common minds. That illusion became Colville's tether. He folded the document carefully. I have seen fraud in many forms, Watson. Counterfeit coin, forged signatures, false testimony. But rarely have I seen a man's mind forged with such care. Colville did not create a haunting. He created a narrative. And he cast Lionel as its sole believer. Lady Eugenia sat very still. Then all of this, it was never real. Holmes gave a small, sad smile. No, my lady, it was worse. It was almost real. We walked the grounds that evening, Holmes, Lady Eugenia and I, beneath skies that remained grey even in their stillness. There was no longer fear at Gallowsmere, but a kind of weariness, as if the house itself had been forced to hold its breath for too long. Holmes was uncharacteristically subdued. He paused near the orchard wall, resting a hand on the lichen-covered stones. There is a particular cruelty, he said softly, in the way fear can erode reason. We imagine madness comes from within, but often it is simply introduced, little by little, like a poison added to wine. I said nothing, sensing the weight in his voice. He continued, We are taught to trust our senses, yet they are the very instruments most easily deceived. A whisper here, a scent there, and the mind begins to drift, away from certainty, away from logic. He turned to Lady Eugenia. Your brother was not weak. He was isolated. He had no one to challenge the dream he was being taught to dream. And now? She asked. Now, Holmes said, he has you. And that, I suspect, is antidote enough. We resumed our walk, the wind tugging gently at the trees. I could not help but think of the countless others, men and women, not haunted by ghosts, but by ideas planted and left to grow in silence. Gallowsmere would recover, but its lesson, I felt, would linger long after the candles had burned out. The North Gallery stood open again by week's end, its heavy doors no longer locked, nor feared. The portrait of Lord Reginald remained, but the illusion had vanished. The blood had been cleaned, the mechanisms dismantled, and the candles removed. What remained was a painting, nothing more. I stood before it one last time, reflecting on all that had passed. It was strange how ordinary it now seemed. The eyes, once said to follow visitors across the room, now stared blankly forward, hollow in their stillness. Holmes entered beside me. There is something fragile in belief, I said quietly. Once broken, it leaves behind a peculiar emptiness. He nodded. Because belief is the architecture of meaning, Watson, and when it collapses, the structure must be rebuilt. Behind us, servants moved freely. The silence had lifted, replaced not by laughter, but by life. The house had not shed its history, but it had reclaimed its future. As we prepared to depart Gallowsmere, Holmes turned once more to the portrait. He studied it not with suspicion, but with quiet curiosity. I wonder, he mused, how many minds have bled simply because the canvas remained unexamined. I said nothing, for no reply was needed. Then he turned to me, and in his voice there was neither triumph nor regret, but something altogether rarer in my friend, melancholy. We chase phantoms, Watson, but they rarely haunt corridors. They dwell in the folds of the mind, and when nourished, they do not vanish. They evolve. He paused, then gave the portrait one final glance. The mind, my dear Watson, he said, is the most haunting gallery of all. And with that, he turned away, leaving the painted eyes behind, and the truth forever etched in shadow. As our carriage pulled away from Gallowsmere Hall, the rising sun casting long shadows across the frost-laced fields, Holmes sat with his chin resting lightly on his knuckles, his gaze distant but sharp. "You know, Watson," he said at length, "it was never the blood, nor the whispers, nor even the shadowed figure that posed the true danger." I looked at him. "Then what did?" "The vacancy," he replied softly, "the space in the mind where doubt is allowed to breed unchecked. Colville didn't plant fear, he merely watered it." He turned to me then, with a faint smile. "We often look for ghosts in the darkness, Watson, but the most persistent hauntings are born not of death, but of clever lies repeated often enough to resemble truth." I nodded, struck as ever by the elegant simplicity of his insight. "And yet," I said, "you banished the spectre without a séance." He allowed himself a small chuckle. "There are few ghosts that survive a thorough examination of the floorboards. What do you think was Professor Colville's greatest miscalculation? Was it underestimating Sir Lionel's mind, or overestimating the silence of a painted canvas? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What clue first made you suspicious? And if you enjoyed unravelling this mystery with Holmes and me, be sure to subscribe for more tales from Baker Street, and share this case with fellow lovers of classic detective fiction. After all, the game is far from over.